Hello there, everybody. Sorry for being late. Little technical difficulty while I figured out how to actually be here. So this is going to be a little recording about grief and just kind of some things that I think a lot of people don't know. I think when we go into grief, there's a lot that we don't know about grief, and there's a lot that sort of takes us by surprise. I am not by any means a counselor. I don't have any kind of grief training other than my own personal experiences with grief. So, if you have access to a grief counselor, many times, like if somebody passes away and they're in hospice, the family members have access to a certain amount of grief counseling. I would advise, go and see somebody um, if you are feeling stuck in your grief. Hello there, Diane. Hello, Francine. This is a topic that is close to my heart because I kind of learned about grief more or less by the seat of my pants when my significant other passed away on October 29th of 2011. So it's been a while now for me. And what's happened that made me decide I wanted to go ahead and do a video like this is I talked to a potential client. I wouldn't say she's even a client at this point, but as we were getting to know each other, she was going through grief. She had lost like 10 friends within the past 6 years and was having a hard time, with losing current friends who wouldn't hang around with her or support her or encourage her in any way because she was dealing with grief and they did not know how to deal with it. So this video is for some people who are going through grief, but it's also for people who aren't going through grief that have friends who are going through grief as well, just so that you can get a better understanding. Anne Marie Mackenza, hello, hello. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the thumbs up, whoever has done that. I appreciate you guys showing up here. So grief, grief, grief. The first thing that I really want to talk about grief is the most important thing to remember, whether you're going through grief or whether you have a friend going through it, is that everyone experiences grief differently. We each have lost somebody who is different. They have a different role to us. Even those of us who lost significant others or spouses, the relationship is always going to be different. And so when you lose that person, how you respond to that is going to be different from every person that you lose along the way in life. And each of us is going to respond in a different way, even to similar situations, because no situation is going to be exactly the same. And so it's not really good to expect one person to handle grief in a particular way just because we handled grief in a particular way. All right. Hello there, Tina. So it's really important if you have grief yourself or if you're dealing with somebody with grief to have your mind open to how that could be affecting them. There could be a lot of different things happening and going on, a lot of different emotions that they're feeling. And for a lot of people, when they go through grief, they get to a point where they don't feel comfortable sharing those emotions. And so this can be something that we kind of deal with more or less closed off in a cave many times, because a lot of times the people around us don't know how to receive or interact with the information that we put out there if we let them know how we're feeling. So grief can be very lonely for those who are going through it, and it can be kind of mystifying for those who are not going through it and don't understand why all of a sudden we're being more reclusive or quiet. Because if you haven't felt grief, to see somebody going through it can be tremendously, tremendously hard, even on the person watching someone they love go through it. So try to be open-minded about what they might be going through, or if you're going through grief, don't beat up on yourself because you're not getting through it as quickly as maybe your friends think you should, or as you thought it would take, or whatever. Okay? So everyone experiences grief differently. Um, so part of the reason everybody experiences grief differently is because, we tend to, until we go through it, we tend to think of grief as simply sadness, loss, missing somebody. But it's not that simple. Many times grief is mingled in with guilt, whether it's logical guilt or whether it's guilt that is completely irrational. And in situations like this, whenever we go through grief, we're not necessarily thinking on the same plane that we normally think on. So where we might be really rational people about any other situation, when it comes to grief and when it comes to the guilt that we may want to assign ourselves or somebody else, we may not be completely rational about that. No, nothing's happened, Dee Dee. We are actually just talking about grief in general because I've been running across people who have been struggling with grief and how to function in the normal world with people who are not in grief. So that's all it is. It's nothing is bad at all. We're just dealing with some issues here that I wish I would have known when I started into it a long time ago. So, sometimes grief can be mingled with guilt, and that can complicate things if somebody feels guilty. And then a lot of times when people feel guilty, they feel shame along with that guilt. So they may not be, even if they are opening up and talking to you about what they're feeling, they may not be telling you that they feel guilty or that they feel shame about things that were attached with the person who has crossed over or that person's death. And so, that can be another challenge for communication. And when you're actually grieving, that can be something that it can be hard to look at that rationally. And sometimes it's good to have help to be able to look at that guilt rationally. It's good to see a counselor or be able to talk to a friend that can help you look at that in a more rational way and figure out, is this irrational guilt or is this rational? And either way, to find a way to make peace with that situation. The other thing that can complicate guilt, I mean, the other thing that can complicate grief, excuse me, is anger. We can have a lot of anger when somebody crosses over. I know for me, I did feel some guilt feelings about some things that had happened while my significant other was still alive. But my bigger thing was I was really angry. I was pissed off that he crossed over. We had things that we still wanted to do together. How dare he leave? And it wasn't like I didn't know he was going. I mean, he had cancer and he had it for a while. And so that anger is not necessarily rational either. It's you in most cases it's not that somebody chooses to go. They just do. And even in those cases where somebody does choose to just leave of their own accord, then a lot of times anger can really play in. And then at the same time, because we don't want to uh, be angry at someone who can't defend themselves, then it's hard for us to express, okay, you know what? I mean, I've had people that, family members have committed suicide or their friends have committed suicide. And it causes anger, it causes hurt, it causes confusion. And then you don't want to say that you're angry at this person who's crossed over because they can't defend themselves from your anger. And so that's something else that we can tend to bottle in as we're grieving. And it's kind of, we do that because we're afraid about what other people would think if they knew that we were angry at this person for leaving or for crossing over. So that's something else that is not so unnormal when you're dealing with grief. And I think that, I would have benefited from knowing that guilt and anger and sometimes confusion are a part of grief. Nobody told me these things. I just felt them and then felt bad about myself for feeling them. So that's part of the reason why I'm doing this video, to let you guys know that this is not um, it's not abnormal. It's normal to have all these mixed up emotions besides just sadness when somebody crosses over. So don't beat up on yourself like I did. Just allow yourself to work through those feelings and process them and know that it's a part of the grief process. Hello there, Samantha Green. Glad to see you, honey. This is a little different type of video than I normally do. We're doing a little sharing of information, is what we're going to call this. Now, the other thing that I learned that I didn't know and that I found incredibly interesting, because I do like to know, oh, well, I'm glad you're here then, and I'm sorry to hear about your loss. That's a tough one. So, the other thing to know about grief that, like I said, I found it intensely interesting. I like to know what makes people tick. Maybe that's part of why I'm a good reader. I like to be able to really dig in and find the motivations and the feelings. Um, so, there are two types of grief. And so some people experience grief in the way that we typically think of grief, which is they after the death they kind of shut down, reclusify. Not that that's really a word, but they become more of a recluse. They may be crying almost 24/7 possibly, but doing a lot of crying and a lot of remembering and looking at pictures and excuse me, and just trying to remember everything they can about this person and sort of hold it all in. A lot of times these people are not going to work for a while. They are just really processing this intensely as they can right after. Okay. And so that's one way of grieving. And then there's another way of grieving, which is almost diametrically opposed to that, which is where somebody, instead of shutting down and not functioning in everyday life, what they do is they go out and they live everyday life. And if anything, they live it in a more bold and audacious way than what they did before. And so, whenever this happens, you may see this person, say somebody passed away, and then the next day or 2 days later, they're back at work. They're trying to do their normal thing, they're trying to function. And they are maybe even trying to live their life to the fullest. And so they're not shutting down. Now, they're probably still going to be crying every once in a while, but they're going to be kind of hiding to do that. You may not notice that. The emotions are still going to be leaking out, whereas with the other kind of grief, the emotions are just pouring out. And so the thing to know about this is if you are in a family who has lost somebody and you have one person grieving one way and you have another person grieving another way, a lot of times these two groups don't understand each other. This group doesn't understand why this person is going to work and trying to live and, you know, being bolder and more audacious than they've ever been before. And this person, this group of people, does not understand why these people are sitting around moping. Because this person is saying, hey, life is precious. Look, this other person died. I'm alive. I'm alive and I have to live my life and I have to live my life really well. And part of that is to honor this person who died. And this other person is over here going, well, wait, how can you be outliving? This person is dead and I am crying my eyeballs out. How are you outliving? You don't care about this person. You never cared about them. So you can see where it's really easy for these two kinds of people to go head to head. All right. And so it's important to, when you're in this situation, to realize that just because somebody's not grieving the same way as you doesn't mean they're not grieving, doesn't mean they don't care. And to be able to give each other the space, to not be impatient with each other, to be able to give each other the space. In a family situation, especially, I've seen it where a younger person dies, maybe one of the children passes away. What happens with the parents is many times you've got one going one way and one going the other way. And the thing about it is this kind of grief, whether they're both going the same way or different ways, doesn't really matter. This kind of grief will either bring you together if you lean on each other, or it will push you apart. And it's something to be aware of as you're going through that. If you find yourself in that situation, is that you don't want to shut down and pull away from that other person. You really want to lean into them harder and allow them to lean into you harder so that you can make it through this as a cohesive unit instead of just going off your own separate ways and letting this be a huge wedge. Okay. Let's see. What else should we talk about here? And if you guys have questions, feel free to throw them out. I'm just telling you guys stuff that I wish I would have known before grief, sort of hit me. So, timelines of grief. We talked about earlier how grief is different for every person because each relationship is different with a person who's crossed over. But timelines are also different for every person. I had I did feel that, but it was more before the passing than after because in my situation, my significant other had cancer for a couple of years before he passed over. So I was really in denial before he passed. Like, this isn't really happening. This is just one big nightmare, and I'm going to wake up and everything will be fine. As far as isolation, I isolated more afterwards because I was somebody who I was the second type of person. I was going to work. I was trying to live as boldly as I could in honor of him. And when I would come home from work, though, I would really have to do self-care because I had been putting on a happy face in front of people. And so I would do a lot of self-care. And so I was like literally screaming my lungs out in my bedroom. And I was isolating for that. I was not being around people for that. So yeah. And everybody goes through it in some way or another. It's just part of the human psyche. Let's see. So timelines are different on grief too. You've got your two different types of grief going on. You've got people that are going through those emotions intensely, and then you've got people that are letting these emotions leak out as they hit overflow. So obviously timelines are going to be different in those two cases. But even within each of those two different ways, timelines are very different on grief. Some people come into a place where they've made peace with the passing and are coming into a place where they have rituals to honor the person, and they're functioning better a lot more quickly than others. And it's just part of our makeup and part of how we're responding to what happened. And so timelines are just as different as any other part of the grief. And the other thing I want to talk about is other people's reactions to grief. I found this quite comical even when I was in the situation. And the comical part was that 2 weeks after my significant other had passed, I had a very good friend who was really trying their best to support me, say, "It's time for you to pull your head out of your butt and get on with life." And I was not the one crying and shut down and not going to work type of grief. I was out there living and just it was coming out at the seams type of grief. And so, to think that somebody could lose a significant other in 2 weeks, be fully functional was ludicrous to me. Absolutely ludicrous to me. And yet, these people who had not gone through grief, it seemed perfectly rational and normal to them. And so that's a really hard part, I think, about going through grief is other people's reactions to what we're going through because they can't not everybody can process it, not everybody understands, not everybody is going to give us the room to grieve the way that we need to grieve or for how long we need to grieve. A lot of the a lot of the thing with grief too is a lot of us are afraid somehow, and it's an irrational fear, but we're afraid that we'll forget the person. And so for some of us, we stay in grief a lot longer than we really need to because we're afraid that if we don't, we'll forget and that it's the same as forgetting. We don't ever forget that person. Even when we come out of grief, we always still think about that person and there's going to be things that remind us of that person and we'll always still miss that person sometimes. But it is a big fear that, well, if I am not grieving, I'll forget about them. Or, if I move on and date somebody else, does that mean I've forgotten about them? No, it doesn't. It just means that you're still alive. Exactly. Exactly. And what was the other thing I wanted to talk about? I didn't write it down and it just flitted through my brain. Oh, the other thing that I want to talk about with grief is, especially for those of you who are watching this who are newer to navigating these waters, grief is a funny thing, and not funny like haha, but funny like strange, because it can hit you really, really, really hard. And then you can start recovering and start feeling really great. And then all of a sudden, well, I won't even say really great, but compared to how well you were feeling really great. And then all of a sudden, it can just like hit you really hard again, like it just happened the day before. And it's tricky like that. It'll just sneak up on you like that. And it'll do that for a while. I mean, that's not something that just goes away. Um, I remember that when I went through my situation, I just thought this first year is going to be the worst holidays ever. With him dying at the end of October, we had Thanksgiving, we had Christmas, we had New Year's. There was his birthday was in November. He died a week before his birthday. Our anniversary was like a week after that. So there was all of these holidays, bam, 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 bam. And I just told myself, well, this will probably be the worst set of holidays I've ever gone through. And then after that, it'll get better. For me, what happened was I had these waves of grief that would sort of come and go. And during the whole first 2 years, and during the whole first 2 years, at any time, holiday or not, I might have it hit where it felt like it happened yesterday. And then for me, after 2 years, that started to ease up. And so I don't generally have it hit like where it happened yesterday anymore. I do still have some times whenever I'm talking about him that, some tears might come out of my eyes or I might actually start crying. And it's been since October of 2011, so 7, almost 8 years. We don't ever forget and we don't ever really stop missing them. But the best thing that we can do to get through grief is we can start to, on those special days that come up, we can set up little ceremonies to remember them and to honor them and to remember the good memories of them. You know, on Valentine's Day, there's a certain hike that I always take, and I go to a certain spot that he and I went to together for the first time when he was still alive, and I think of him and I think towards him. I talk to him when I'm out in that spot. There are certain things that I do for birthday, certain things that I do for anniversary, just to honor him. And during those times, yeah, I might cry a little bit, but mostly I think about the good memories that we had together. And that's really where you get to on the other side of grief, when you can look at the things that you did together that were good and that were positive, and you can think about them and they can crack you up or make you smile. That's when you know that you've really gotten to the other side where you've made peace with this situation. And you also, at that point, I'm not going to forget this person. You know it in your heart. You don't have that fear anymore. So, you know, I would advise set up some of those rituals for yourself as soon as you can. Something that just says, whatever holiday you want to honor that was between you and that person. And, do something that they would appreciate, you know. If they like to ride horses, maybe pick a day and go out and ride horses and think of them or something like that. That kind of helps process. It helps to let go of some of the anger and guilt and just the sadness, just to know, okay, I'm doing something to honor this person. And that's what can really, really help you through. And then the last thing that I want to say, and I feel awkward saying this because it's about Reiki and how much Reiki can help. And I am a Reiki master and I do provide Reiki. And so I don't want you guys to think that I did this all as an advertisement for Reiki, because I didn't. And I don't want you guys to think that, you should come get Reiki from me if you're grieving, because, you know, maybe, maybe you guys have your own Reiki practitioner or master. But the thing that I have noticed is I have had a lot of clients be benefited by Reiki to help them to process through the grief more quickly. And I actually was benefited by the Reiki to help me process through the grief more quickly. It took me 5 years to get to the point of saying, I release you and I bless you on your way. 5 years. And I had a lot of Reiki by the time that I said that. I had actually had my Reiki master attunement the same day that I met him, the anniversary of that day. And it was that evening that I was able to release him and bless him on his way. And I really think that the Reiki had so much to do with me being able to do that. And so I've also had clients that have come to me that have felt stuck in their grief. And the Reiki, even just one session of Reiki, really helps a lot to bring in some peace and some calmness and some understanding. So that's one thing that I would recommend. Do get yourself, some ceremonies so that you remember the person in a positive way. And then also, if you have access to Reiki, get a hold of some Reiki to help you process through that grief, um, especially if you're feeling stuck in the grief. If you're feeling like you've come to a place and you're just not really progressing forward or moving through, then that especially is when I would say, um, get yourself some Reiki. So that's really the last thing I have to say, but I can't see you guys' chat to see what questions you're asking. So give me a second. Let me go into my back office because I don't want to miss out. I'm sure you guys have some really great questions. So I want to make sure that I can see them and answer them. Sorry, guys. I should have set this up before, but I'm always anticipating that everything will work beautifully. Do I ever feel my loved one around after? Actually, I did, and I do. And that's one of the things that I talked with my grief counselor about. And it was kind of interesting what she said because I was really worried about myself because not only was I feeling him around, I was having conversations with him. Some of you who have been hanging out with me for a long time know that I became a psychic and a medium because of his passing. And so I was having conversations with him where I was hearing him respond to things that I would think towards him in my head. And so I told my grief counselor, I'm really worried about me. I think maybe I should be in a padded room somewhere. And she asked me why. And so I told her that that was why. And what she said is that a lot of times you will feel your loved one around you or sense your loved one around you in some way, whether you feel them or hear them or whatever. Sometimes people even smell their loved one around. And that they will be around giving us messages and signs like that until we are okay with letting them leave. And then that's when we won't notice their presence around anymore. So I thought that was really interesting. She suggested a timeline of like about 3 months. But I go back to the whole everybody grieves differently. And I know from my medium work that the spirits who cross over, many times they will hang out with us until they feel like we're okay. There really is no timeline. And especially if we had a hard time with the death, like for instance, if it was sudden, if it was unexpected, if the person died way younger than what they really, quote unquote, should have, so to speak, then many times those spirits stay around to console and comfort for a long time, just depending how well the people who are left behind are processing and doing. From my experience, what I've seen is they stay around until we come to the point that we've made peace with the situation. There's no timeline for that, I don't think. I haven't seen a real one. Any more questions? I've covered everything that I had written down that I wanted to throw out there for you guys. I think my biggest point is for those of you who are grieving, don't beat yourself up if you're not getting through it as fast as the people around you think you should be, or if you're not getting through it as fast as the neighbor who, was in a similar situation. Don't beat yourself up. I don't think that I've experienced my loved one coming back as an animal, although I do think that he coordinated something so that I could receive messages from an animal at one point, or a group of animals. Like butterflies, if you see a butterfly, the esoteric meaning of that, one of them is that a young man is in love with you. And one day I was walking along by the creek, and it wasn't that long after he had passed. And there were so many butterflies down by the creek near my home that I literally, probably within my scope of vision, had at least 150 to 200 butterflies at any given moment for most of that walk. And they were all different varieties of butterflies. I mean, there were butterflies I've never even seen before. So I have experienced him coordinating things. I have not experienced him as the actual animal. hmm Thank you, Samantha Green, for being here and hanging out with me. You have swarms there daily. This is a place where I walked every day at that time. It was very healing for me to get out and get into nature. And I would usually see maybe 15 butterflies on that walk. It's about an hour-long walk for me. And so that day was very unusual. Very unusual. It was like all the butterflies were migrating at the same time. So anyway, if you guys don't have any more questions, I guess I'm going to get out of here. I hope that you guys found this absolutely helpful. And yes, I still walk there. I've never had another flock of butterflies in that area since then. Um, Thank you all. Everybody have a fantastic, wonderful, thrilling, and peaceful day. And I'll see y'all on the next video.